There is a point in every person's life where knowledge stops being the problem. They know what to do, they understand the steps, they can even see the outcome clearly in their mind, and yet something still stops them. Not confusion, not lack of ability, something more subtle and more powerful. Fear that does not announce itself loudly, but instead operates quietly beneath every decision. It shows up as hesitation, as overthinking, as waiting for the right moment, as the need to feel ready before acting. And beneath all of it is the same invisible structure, self-doubt disguised as caution. This is where most lives stall. Not because people are incapable of action, but because action becomes emotionally expensive. Every move feels like it carries identity risk. Every decision feels like it could confirm internal fears of inadequacy. So the mind does what it thinks is safest. It delays, it analyzes, it postpones, it builds complexity where simplicity is required. But confidence is not the absence of fear. That is a misunderstanding that keeps people stuck. Real confidence is not emotional comfort before action. It is the ability to act while uncertainty still exists. It is movement without waiting for internal permission. It is execution without emotional guarantees. The confidence code is not a feeling, it is a structure, a way the mind organizes action so that fear does not control behavior and self-doubt does not interrupt execution. When this structure is missing, people live inside internal negotiation. Every decision becomes a debate between what they want and what they fear, between what they know and what they doubt. That internal debate is what destroys momentum, not lack of intelligence, not lack of opportunity, but constant interruption of action by internal resistance loops. To eliminate self-doubt, the system must be rewritten, not by forcing positivity or suppressing fear, but by changing the role fear plays in decision-making. Fear cannot be removed entirely, it is part of human perception, but it can be downgraded from authority to information. Instead of fear being a stop signal, it becomes a signal of importance. Instead of self-doubt being a command to pause, it becomes a signal that growth is being approached. The emotional response remains, but its control over behavior is removed. This is where real confidence begins, not in the feeling of certainty, but in the ability to act without needing certainty. In the chapters ahead, the system will be built from the ground up. You will see how self-doubt forms, how it controls behavior without being noticed, and how it can be systematically dismantled through structured action, perception control, and identity reorganization. Because confidence is not something you wait for, it is something you build by refusing to negotiate with hesitation. Chapter 1. The hidden mechanism of self-doubt, how hesitation becomes a habit. Self-doubt does not begin as a dramatic internal conflict. It does not arrive with obvious warnings or loud emotional signals. It begins quietly in the small gap between intention and action. That gap is where hesitation lives, and hesitation is where identity slowly becomes unstable. Most people assume self-doubt is a feeling. It is not. It is a learned behavioral pattern reinforced over time through repeated moments of delayed action. Each time a person thinks about doing something and does not do it, the mind records a subtle lesson. Action is optional, but hesitation is allowed. Over time, that allowance becomes structure. The brain is not designed to distinguish between thinking about action and partial action. To the nervous system, repeated consideration without execution becomes a form of completion. The mind feels like it has engaged with the task, even though nothing has been done. This creates a dangerous illusion of productivity without output. This is where self-doubt begins to embed itself into behavior. At first, it appears harmless. A delay here, a postponement there, a moment of waiting for more clarity. But each delay strengthens the internal permission system for avoidance. The mind starts to associate uncertainty with pause instead of movement. And once pause becomes the default response to uncertainty, confidence begins to weaken at its core. Confidence is not built by knowing what to do. It is built by acting while not fully knowing. When action is repeatedly postponed until certainty is achieved, the system never develops trust in execution. Instead, It builds dependency on perfect internal conditions that never consistently exist in real life. Self-doubt thrives in this dependency. It grows stronger every time action is delayed for emotional readiness, because every delay reinforces the belief that readiness is required before movement. But in reality, readiness is not a precondition for action. It is a byproduct of action. Another critical layer of self-doubt is internal contradiction. A person wants to act but simultaneously evaluates whether action is safe, acceptable, or guaranteed to succeed. This creates a split in the mind. One part pushes forward, another part pulls back. The result is paralysis disguised as thinking. This internal conflict is exhausting, and over time the mind begins to avoid situations that trigger it. Not because those situations are impossible, but because the internal friction they produce becomes uncomfortable. Avoidance then becomes a strategy for reducing discomfort, not solving problems. That is how self-doubt becomes self-reinforcing. It reduces discomfort in the short term while increasing limitation in the long term. Another layer is identity feedback distortion. Every action a person takes feeds back into how they see themselves. When action is consistent, identity stabilizes. When action is inconsistent, identity becomes fragmented. And once identity becomes fragmented, even small decisions feel heavy because they carry perceived identity consequences. This is why hesitation grows stronger over time. It is not just about fear of failure, it is about fear of confirming a weakened identity. But identity is not fixed. It is a reflection of repeated behavior, not internal belief. Every time action replaces hesitation, identity strengthens. Every time hesitation replaces action, identity weakens. Self-doubt is simply the accumulation of unchallenged hesitation patterns. The most important realization is this: self-doubt is not a truth about capability. It is a history of delayed execution. And because it is built through repetition, it can also be dismantled through repetition. Not through motivation, not through insight alone, but through consistent behavioral override of hesitation. In the next chapter, we will break down the exact psychological loop that turns fear into inaction and how to interrupt it at the moment it begins forming, before it becomes behavior. Chapter 2. The Fear Loop. How the mind trains itself to avoid action. Fear is often misunderstood as an emotional reaction to danger, but in the context of self-doubt and performance, fear is more accurately a prediction system. It is the mind attempting to simulate future outcomes and avoid potential pain before it happens. The problem is not fear itself. The problem is what fear teaches the mind to do repeatedly. Over time, fear does not just warn, it begins to decide. And when fear becomes a decision maker, action becomes secondary. The fear loop begins with perception. A situation appears that carries uncertainty. It could be a decision, a task, a conversation, or an opportunity. The mind instantly begins scanning for possible negative outcomes. This happens automatically without conscious intent. At first, this is neutral. It is simply awareness, but then interpretation begins. The mind does not just see possibilities, it evaluates them emotionally. Some outcomes feel uncomfortable, risky, or threatening to self-image. That emotional discomfort is the key trigger. Because the mind is designed to reduce discomfort quickly, it begins searching for escape routes, not physical escape, but cognitive escape, delaying action, overthinking, gathering more information, waiting for clarity. This is where the loop forms. Perception creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates emotional discomfort. Emotional discomfort creates avoidance behavior. Avoidance temporarily reduces discomfort. And that reduction is recorded as successful strategy by the brain. This is the core reinforcement mechanism of fear. Not that fear is experienced, but that avoidance is rewarded. Every time a person avoids action due to fear, the nervous system learns a powerful lesson. Avoidance works. It reduces immediate tension. It creates temporary relief. And because the brain prioritizes immediate relief over long-term consequence, avoidance becomes the default response pattern. This is how fear becomes trained into behavior. Over time, the loop strengthens. the threshold for fear becomes lower. Situations that previously felt manageable begin to trigger hesitation, not because the person has become weaker, but because the avoidance pathway has become more efficient than the action pathway. Efficiency matters to the brain more than correctness in the short term. Another layer of the fear loop is imagined consequence amplification. When action is delayed, the mind does not remain neutral. It continues simulating outcomes. But without real feedback from action, these simulations become increasingly exaggerated. The longer action is delayed, the more dramatic the imagined consequences become. Small risks become large threats. Temporary discomfort becomes permanent failure. Reversible mistakes become irreversible identity damage. This distortion increases emotional resistance further, which reinforces more avoidance. And this is why fear feels stronger the longer you wait. It is not external reality changing, it is internal simulation expanding without correction. Another critical element is identity projection. When a person considers action, they are not only thinking about the task itself, they are also projecting what the outcome will say about them. Success becomes validation, failure becomes evidence of inadequacy. This turns simple tasks into identity tests, and identity tests feel dangerous to the nervous system, so the system naturally resists engagement. But this interpretation is not fixed, it is learned. Action does not define identity. Repeated action defines identity. The fear loop reverses this truth and treats a single outcome as a permanent label. This distortion is what creates paralysis. Another important mechanism is the illusion of control through thinking. When fear appears, the mind increases analysis to regain a sense of control. It believes that more thinking will reduce uncertainty. But in reality, excessive thinking without action increases uncertainty, because thinking without feedback creates divergence from reality. The longer the gap between thinking and acting, the less accurate the thinking becomes. So the fear loop continues to grow. More thinking, less action, more uncertainty, more fear, more avoidance. Breaking this loop requires interrupting it at its weakest point, not at the level of emotion, but at the level of response timing. The moment fear appears, before it is allowed to expand into simulation or avoidance, action must begin in a minimal form, not full execution, not perfect execution. But immediate engagement with reality, because fear cannot survive contact with structured action, it survives only in delay. In the next chapter, we will build the mechanism that overrides this loop completely, not by removing fear, but by making action faster than fear can organize itself into hesitation. Chapter 3. The Override Mechanism. Acting before doubt becomes decision. If self-doubt is built through repeated hesitation, then it cannot be dismantled through thinking alone. It must be interrupted at the exact point where hesitation begins forming into behavior. This is where the override mechanism becomes essential. The override mechanism is not emotional control, it is not confidence building in the traditional sense. It is a structural timing system that forces action to occur before doubt has enough time to fully assemble itself into resistance. Self-doubt is not instant. It requires processing time. When a decision appears, doubt does not emerge fully formed, it develops in stages. First comes awareness, then comes evaluation, then comes imagined consequence, then comes emotional weighting, and finally, hesitation becomes action delay. Most people engage with this entire sequence without interruption. They allow doubt to fully form before responding. By the time they attempt to act, the system is already overloaded with resistance. The override mechanism works by cutting into this sequence early. The key principle is this: action must begin during the earliest stage of awareness, before evaluation matures into emotional resistance. This requires retraining the relationship between perception and response speed. Instead of perception leading to analysis, perception must lead directly to movement. This does not mean acting without awareness. It means minimizing the gap between awareness and execution so that analysis does not become a separate internal phase. When this gap is removed, doubt loses its structure, because doubt requires time to form narrative. Without time, it cannot stabilize into resistance. Another important layer is pre-decision compression. Most hesitation comes from trying to decide everything at once: outcome, risk, identity impact, future consequences. The mind attempts to resolve the entire decision tree before taking a single step. The override mechanism breaks this by reducing decision scope to the smallest possible unit, the next physical or cognitive action, not the full outcome, not the entire plan, just the next irreversible step forward. This shifts the brain from simulation mode into execution mode. Another critical component is behavioral momentum initiation. Once movement begins, even at a small scale, cognitive resistance decreases significantly. The brain interprets action as commitment already in progress, which reduces internal debate. This is why starting is more important than optimizing. Movement reorganizes cognition. Stillness amplifies doubt. Another mechanism is identity bypassing. Self-doubt often activates identity evaluation. What if I fail? Becomes, what does failure say about me? This identity layer is what intensifies hesitation. The override mechanism bypasses identity evaluation entirely by removing identity from the decision moment. The action is treated as functional, not definitional. It is something that happens, something that defines worth. This removes emotional weight from execution. Another important principle is time compression training. The mind must be conditioned to respond faster than doubt can complete its internal sequence. This is not speed for urgency's sake. It is speed as structural protection against hesitation formation. If response is immediate, doubt cannot complete its loop. If response is delayed, doubt takes control of the system. Over time, this creates a new behavioral default: action before interpretation completion. Another layer is discomfort, tolerance, integration. The override mechanism does not require fear to disappear. It requires the ability to act while discomfort is still present. This is critical because waiting for fear to vanish is itself a form of hesitation. Confidence is not absence of discomfort. It is movement despite it. As this system develops, something shifts fundamentally. The mind stops treating doubt as a signal to pause and starts treating it as background noise that does not influence behavior. Action becomes the primary system. Doubt becomes a secondary, non-controlling signal. And once that hierarchy is established, hesitation loses its authority completely. Chapter 4: Identity under pressure. Why self-doubt feels personal. Self-doubt becomes most powerful not when it questions your actions, but when it begins to question who you are. At that point, hesitation is no longer about a task. It becomes about identity. And when identity is involved, even small decisions feel heavy because every action feels like it is confirming something permanent about the self. This is where most people get trapped. They do not just think, I might fail. They begin to feel, if I fail, it means something about me. That subtle shift transforms normal uncertainty into emotional threat. The mind is no longer protecting performance, it is protecting identity. But identity is not as fixed as it feels. It is not a single object. It is a pattern of reinforcement built over time through repeated behavior, interpretation, and memory. Every time a person hesitates, avoids, or delays action, the mind records not only the event, but the implied identity behind it. I didn't act becomes, I am someone who doesn't act. This is how identity distortion begins. The problem is not that people lack ability. The problem is that their identity becomes shaped more by avoidance than by action. And because identity is what the mind uses to predict future behavior, this creates a self-reinforcing loop. If you believe you hesitate, the mind expects hesitation. If the mind expects hesitation, it produces hesitation automatically. Self-doubt, at its deepest level, is identity prediction based on past inaction. Another critical layer is identity protection behavior. When people feel uncertain, they unconsciously protect their self-image by avoiding situations where failure is possible. This is not laziness, it is defensive cognition. The mind is trying to prevent identity damage. But this protection comes at a cost. It prevents exposure to the very actions that could rebuild identity strength. Confidence does not emerge from protection. It emerges from repeated exposure to action under uncertainty. Every action taken in uncertainty creates a small correction in identity structure. Every avoided action reinforces fragility. Over time, the gap between perceived identity and actual capability widens. This gap is where self-doubt grows strongest. Another important mechanism is narrative identity formation. The mind builds stories about the self. I am not consistent, I overthink things, I am not confident, I struggle with decisions. These narratives feel like self-awareness, but they are actually accumulated interpretations of past hesitation patterns. Once these narratives solidify, they begin influencing future behavior. The mind tries to stay consistent with its own story. If the story is "I hesitate," then hesitation becomes the default behavior to maintain internal consistency. This is why identity must be rewritten through action, not analysis. Another layer is emotional identity anchoring. People often anchor identity in emotional experiences rather than behavioral patterns. A single moment of failure can feel more defining than dozens of moments of quiet progress. This is because emotional intensity strengthens memory encoding. But emotional memory is not structural truth. It is simply a high-intensity snapshot, not a full representation of capability. Self-doubt grows when emotional snapshots dominate identity formation. To break this, identity must be rebuilt through repetition of action under low emotional distortion. Not dramatic change, but consistent behavior that contradicts the old narrative. Another important principle is identity lag. Even after behavior changes, identity does not update instantly. There is a delay between what you do and what you believe about yourself. During this lag, self-doubt often resurfaces because the mind still operates on outdated identity data. This is where most people quit. They act differently but still feel like the old version of themselves and assume nothing has changed. But identity always updates slowly. The key is persistence through the lag period. Over time, behavior overwrites narrative. Another critical insight is this: identity is not the cause of action. It is the result of repeated action. Trying to feel confident before acting reverses the natural order of development. It places identity before behavior instead of after it. True transformation happens when behavior leads and identity follows. When this structure is understood, self-doubt stops being an identity crisis, becomes a temporary mismatch between current behavior and outdated self-perception. And that mismatch is solvable only through continued action, not internal debate. Chapter 5. The action. First principle: breaking the need to feel ready. At the core of self-doubt is a single hidden rule most people never notice: the belief that action must be preceded by readiness. This belief feels logical, but it is the primary mechanism that keeps hesitation alive. Readiness is treated as a signal that everything is aligned internally before movement begins. But in real environments, alignment is rare. Conditions are rarely perfect, emotions are rarely stable, information is rarely complete. So if readiness is required, action is almost always delayed. The action-first principle reverses this structure completely. Instead of waiting for readiness to appear, readiness is generated through action. Movement becomes the trigger for clarity, not the result of it. The mind does not become ready and then act. It acts and becomes ready through feedback. This is a fundamental shift in how confidence is built. Another important factor is the illusion of preparation. Self-doubt often disguises itself as preparation behavior, researching more, thinking longer, refining plans, waiting for better timing. These activities feel productive, but they often serve as structured avoidance. Preparation becomes infinite when it is not anchored to execution. There is always more to consider, more to optimize, more to understand. Without action anchoring, preparation never ends. The action-first principle introduces a limit. Preparation only exists to support immediate execution. If it does not lead to action, it is not preparation, it is delay. Another key mechanism is reducing the activation threshold for behavior. Most people set the threshold for action too high. They believe they must feel confident, certain, or fully prepared before beginning. This creates a barrier that rarely gets crossed. The action-first system lowers the threshold to the smallest possible unit, beginning, not completing, not mastering, just starting. Starting breaks inertia, and inertia is what self-doubt depends on. Another important principle is immediate engagement with reality. Self-doubt grows strongest in imagination. The longer a person stays in thought without action, the more distorted their perception becomes. Reality corrects distortion. Thinking without action amplifies it. By engaging immediately, even in small ways, the system prevents imagination from dominating perception. Another layer is behavioral override of emotional state. Many people wait for fear to disappear before acting, but emotional states are not designed to disappear before action. They are designed to exist alongside action. The action-first principle teaches the system that emotional discomfort is not a stopping condition. It is simply a background condition during movement. Another important transformation is decoupling performance from feeling. High performance does not require feeling confident. It requires functioning despite uncertainty. When this is understood, emotional state loses its authority over execution. Another key mechanism is momentum-based confidence building. Confidence does not appear before action. It accumulates after repeated successful engagement with uncertainty. Each action taken without readiness builds internal evidence that action is safe. Over time, this evidence replaces doubt. Another principle is reduction of decision complexity at initiation. The more complex a decision feels at the start, the more likely it is to be delayed. The action-first system simplifies initiation to a binary state: act or do not act. No extended internal negotiation. This prevents hesitation loops from forming. Another important factor is breaking emotional dependency on certainty. Certainty is often treated as a prerequisite for action, but in dynamic environments, certainty is rarely available. Waiting for it creates permanent delay. Action-first behavior accepts uncertainty as normal operating context. At this point, something becomes clear. Self-doubt does not survive in systems where action happens before readiness, because doubt requires time, interpretation, and hesitation, and action-first systems remove all three. Chapter 6: The Internal Negotiation Trap. Why thinking more creates less action. One of the most deceptive mechanisms behind self-doubt is the belief that better thinking leads to better action. On the surface, this seems logical. If a decision is important, it makes sense to think it through carefully. But under pressure, and especially in moments that require confidence, thinking becomes something very different from clarity. It becomes negotiation. Internal negotiation is the process where the mind debates with itself instead of acting. One part pushes forward, another part questions risk, another part searches for alternatives, and another part tries to predict outcomes. What should have been a simple execution moment becomes a multi-layered internal courtroom where every possible outcome is argued, but none are resolved through action. The illusion here is that progress is being made because thinking is happening, but in reality, nothing is moving forward. The system is simulating movement instead of producing it, and simulation creates emotional satisfaction without real-world change. But this is why overthinking feels productive even when it is not. The longer internal negotiation continues, the more authority doubt gains. Because doubt thrives in unresolved space, it does not need to win the argument, it only needs the argument to continue. Another critical aspect of this trap is that the mind begins to treat every possible action as reversible in theory, but irreversible in emotion. This means that even though logically a decision can be changed later, emotionally it feels final in the moment. That emotional distortion increases hesitation dramatically. So the mind tries to solve every possible future consequence before acting. But future consequences cannot be fully simulated. The system is attempting to achieve certainty in an environment that does not provide it. This creates endless cognitive loops. Another layer is false optimization. The mind begins searching for the best possible action instead of a valid action. This shifts focus from execution to perfection. And perfection is infinite. There is always a better angle, a better timing, a better approach. So instead of acting, the system continues refining mental models that never reach execution. This is how intelligence becomes a barrier to progress, Not because thinking is wrong, but because thinking is being used in place of action rather than in support of it. Another key mechanism is emotional justification layering. When action is delayed, the mind does not admit avoidance directly. Instead, it builds rational explanations. I'm still planning. I need more information. It's not the right time. I should be more prepared. These justifications feel reasonable, but they are post hoc constructions designed to protect the mind from discomfort. The underlying behavior remains avoidance, but it is masked as strategy. Over time, this creates a dangerous illusion. The person believes they are being careful, when in reality they are being stalled by internal resistance. Another important dynamic is the expansion of perceived risk during delay. The longer action is postponed, the more the mind magnifies potential consequences. This is because the brain continues simulating outcomes without corrective feedback from reality. So imagination becomes increasingly distorted, small risks become exaggerated threats, manageable challenges become identity-level dangers. This is why hesitation always makes action feel harder, not easier. Another critical factor is the breakdown of decision freshness. There is a short window where a decision is still clean, unweighted, and neutral. In that window, action is relatively easy. But once internal negotiation begins, emotional weight accumulates on the decision. Each new thought adds friction. Each new analysis adds hesitation. Each new consideration increases psychological resistance. By the time the decision is finally made, it is no longer the same decision. It has been overloaded with emotional and cognitive baggage. Another key insight is that internal negotiation does not improve accuracy under pressure. It only increases delay. And in real-world environments, delayed accuracy is often worse than immediate imperfect action because conditions change faster than analysis can keep up. This is why high-performance systems prioritize execution speed over theoretical perfection. The solution is not to stop thinking. The solution is to define a strict boundary where thinking ends and action begins. Once that boundary is reached, further thinking is no longer part of the decision process. It becomes interference. When this structure is enforced consistently, internal negotiation loses its authority. The mind learns that thinking supports action but does not replace it. And once that separation is stable, hesitation stops growing into full paralysis. It remains just a passing signal, not a controlling system. Chapter 7. Micro-action. Discipline: how confidence is built in small, irreversible steps. Confidence is often imagined as a large emotional shift, a moment where fear disappears and certainty arrives. But in practice, confidence does not emerge from large emotional breakthroughs. It is constructed through small, repeated behavioral confirmations that action is safe, even in uncertainty. This is where micro-action discipline becomes essential. Micro-action discipline is the ability to reduce any task, decision, or challenge into the smallest possible irreversible step, and then execute it immediately without negotiation. Not later, not after preparation, but at the point of recognition. Most self-doubt exists because actions are treated as large, identity-heavy events. When a task feels big, the mind attaches emotional weight to it. That weight creates resistance, and resistance creates delay. Micro-action discipline removes the weight by shrinking the action until it no longer triggers resistance. Instead of start the project, the system begins with opening the document. Instead of fix the problem, it begins with identifying the first visible element. Instead of become confident, it begins with a single act of movement despite hesitation. This reduction changes everything because the nervous system does not resist small, low-threat actions in the same way it resists large, identity-defining ones. Another critical aspect is that micro-actions bypass internal negotiation. There is not enough cognitive space for full doubt formation when the action is immediate and minimal. The mind does not have time to construct resistance narratives, so action happens before doubt stabilizes. Another key mechanism is momentum stacking. One micro-action leads to another, not through motivation, but through reduced activation cost. Once movement begins, the barrier for the next step decreases significantly. This creates a chain of execution that feels natural rather than forced. Another important principle is identity reconstruction through repetition. Each completed micro-action sends a signal to the nervous system. Action is safe, action is possible, action does not result in identity damage. Over time, these signals overwrite older patterns of hesitation. Confidence is not built by thinking, "I am confident." It is built by accumulating evidence that action consistently occurs despite uncertainty. Another layer is reducing emotional entry points. Large actions allow emotion to enter before execution. Micro-actions prevent this by being too small to trigger emotional escalation. This allows behavior to lead without emotional interruption. Another important factor is removal of outcome focus during initiation. Micro-actions are not evaluated based on success or failure outcomes. They are evaluated only on completion. This prevents emotional distortion during execution. The goal is not to succeed at everything immediately. The goal is to establish consistent movement that builds internal trust. Another key transformation is breaking the illusion of readiness. When actions are large, the mind believes readiness is required. When actions are small, readiness becomes irrelevant. You do not need to feel ready to open a file, send a message, or take the first step. You only need to act. This removes one of the core pillars of self-doubt, the waiting state. Another principle is accumulation-based confidence. Confidence is not a single event. It is the result of repeated confirmation that action is possible under imperfect conditions. Each micro-action adds a layer to this structure. Over time, hesitation loses its predictive power because action becomes the default response. Another important insight is that micro-actions are not about productivity. They are about identity stabilization through behavior. Productivity is a byproduct. Confidence is the primary outcome. At this stage, something becomes clear. Self-doubt does not disappear through insight. It disappears through repeated proof that action is always smaller and more accessible than fear makes it appear. And when action becomes smaller than fear, fear loses its ability to control behavior. Chapter 8: Emotional Noise Control. Staying functional. When the mind becomes loud. At a certain point in self-development, the problem is no longer lack of knowledge or lack of ability. It becomes interference. The mind is capable, but it is noisy. Thoughts overlap. Emotions rise and fall without structure. Attention jumps between possibilities instead of locking onto execution. This internal noise is one of the main reasons self-doubt persists even in intelligent and aware individuals, because doubt does not always appear as a single thought like, "I can't do this." More often, it appears as background interference that slowly degrades clarity until action feels heavier than it should. Emotional noise is not random. It is structured mental activity that has lost alignment with action. When thoughts are not anchored to execution, they begin to circulate internally. They repeat, expand, and interact with emotional signals, creating a loop of increasing internal intensity without external progress. This is where hesitation becomes more subtle. The person is not explicitly refusing action. Instead, they are internally overloaded. Too many signals, too many interpretations, too many imagined outcomes running at once. The result is paralysis disguised as awareness. The first step in controlling emotional noise is recognizing that not all internal activity is useful thinking. Some of it is residual processing, some of it is emotional echo, some of it is predictive simulation that has no grounding in current reality. Without structure, the mind treats all of it as equally important. This creates cognitive congestion. A functional system separates signal from noise. Signal is anything directly related to immediate action. Noise is anything that does not change what needs to be done next. Most self-doubt emerges from noise being mistaken for signal. Another key mechanism is emotional amplification through repetition. A single concern, when repeated internally, gains emotional weight it did not originally have. The repetition itself creates intensity, not the content. This is why anxious or doubtful thoughts feel stronger over time, even when nothing externally has changed. the system is reinforcing its own signals through repetition loops. To control this, repetition must be interrupted structurally, not emotionally. That means shifting attention away from internal loops and toward external execution points. Action breaks repetition. Stillness feeds it. Another important layer is unresolved thought retention. The mind tends to hold on to incomplete thoughts as if they require resolution before action. But most thoughts do not require resolution. They require dismissal or execution. Holding them internally creates background pressure that feels like doubt. Emotional noise also increases when the mind tries to simulate too many future scenarios at once. Each scenario carries emotional weight, and together they create overload, but none of these scenarios are real yet. They are projections competing for attention. The system must be trained to limit simulation to only what directly impacts the next step. Everything else is deferred or discarded. Another critical principle is state independence. Emotional noise often tricks the system into believing that internal state must stabilize before action is possible. This creates a false dependency. I need to feel clear before I can act. But clarity does not precede action in complex environments. It emerges through action. So the system must operate even while internal noise is present, not by suppressing it, but by ignoring its authority. Noise can exist without control. Another key factor is attention anchoring. When attention is unstructured, it naturally drifts toward uncertainty and imagined problems. Anchoring attention to immediate physical or cognitive steps reduces the space available for emotional expansion. This is not distraction, it is directional control. Another important transformation is the reduction of internal commentary. The mind often narrates experience continuously. What might happen, what could go wrong, what should have been done differently. This narration is what turns simple situations into emotionally heavy experiences. When commentary decreases, clarity increases automatically. Emotional noise is not removed by force. It is reduced by removing its ability to influence behavior. When internal signals no longer control action, they gradually lose intensity because they are no longer reinforced. At this stage, something becomes clear. Self-doubt is not just fear. It is unmanaged internal activity competing for authority over behavior. And when that authority is removed, the noise remains, but it no longer matters. Chapter 9. Decision compression, turning overthinking into immediate execution. One of the strongest fuel sources of self-doubt is expanded decision time. The longer a decision remains open, the more layers it accumulates. Each layer adds complexity, emotional weight, and perceived risk. What begins as a simple choice becomes a mental structure so large that action feels overwhelming. Decision compression is the process of reducing the time and structure of decision-making so that execution happens before doubt fully forms. It is not about rushing blindly. It is about eliminating unnecessary decision expansion. Most people believe better decisions come from more thinking, but in real environments, excessive thinking often reduces decision quality because it disconnects cognition from real-time conditions. The decision becomes theoretical rather than functional. Decision compression restores alignment between thinking and action by limiting how long a decision is allowed to exist before it must become behavior. The first principle is reduction of decision layers. Every decision contains layers: what to do, how to do it, what might happen, what it means, and whether it is worth it. In unstable minds, all layers are processed simultaneously. This creates overload. In compressed systems, only the first layer is allowed to exist before action begins. The rest are resolved through execution, not pre-analysis. Another key mechanism is time-bound decision closure. Once awareness of a decision appears, it is given a very short internal window before execution must begin. If the decision is not executed within that window, it becomes overprocessed and loses clarity. This prevents stagnation in analysis. Another important principle is elimination of recursive thinking. Recursive thinking is when the mind revisits the same decision multiple times, each time adding new interpretation without new information. This creates the illusion of progress while actually increasing hesitation. A decision compression stops recursion by enforcing forward-only processing. Once a decision is acknowledged, it moves forward into action or is discarded completely. No looping. Another key factor is simplification of outcome dependency. Many decisions feel difficult because the mind attaches emotional importance to the outcome. If this works, it means something about me. If it fails, it means something about me. This transforms simple decisions into identity evaluations. Decision compression removes identity from outcome evaluation. Outcomes are treated as feedback, not judgment. This reduces emotional resistance to action significantly. Another principle is pre-action clarity threshold reduction. Most people wait for high clarity before acting, but high clarity is rarely available before engagement. So the system must learn to act at low but sufficient clarity levels. This shifts decision-making from perfection-based to functionality-based. Another important transformation is breaking the illusion of irreversible decisions. Many decisions feel final, which increases hesitation. But most real-world decisions are adjustable after action begins. Recognizing this reduces pressure dramatically. Action becomes reversible adaptation rather than permanent commitment. Another key mechanism is removal of emotional inflation during decision-making. As time increases, emotional weight increases artificially. A decision that feels small at the start becomes heavy after extended thinking. Compression prevents emotional inflation by limiting exposure time. Another principle is execution first resolution. Instead of solving the entire decision internally, the system begins execution and resolves complexity through feedback from reality. Real-world feedback replaces internal simulation. This restores accuracy and reduces mental distortion. Another important factor is minimizing cognitive branching. Each additional possible option increases mental load. Compressed systems reduce options to the minimum viable path forward, not the optimal imagined one. At this stage, something becomes clear. Self-doubt does not survive fast, structured decision systems, because doubt requires time, expansion, and emotional build-up. And decision compression removes all three. Chapter 10. The Confidence Code, Acting Without Fear, Living Without Self-Doubt. At the deepest level of human behavior, confidence is not a personality trait. It is not something you are born with or something you permanently lack. It is a system outcome, a result of how quickly the mind converts intention into action, and how little space is allowed for self-doubt to intervene between those 2 points. By this stage, every layer we have explored, fear loops, identity distortion, internal negotiation, emotional noise, decision expansion, and hesitation conditioning, converges into one final realization. Self-doubt only exists in the gap between thought and execution. Close that gap, and confidence is no longer something you try to build. It becomes what naturally remains. The confidence code is not about removing fear. Fear will always appear as a biological response to uncertainty. The mistake most people make is believing that confidence requires fearlessness, but fearlessness is not human, and it is not necessary. What matters is whether fear is allowed to influence behavior. In a structured mind, fear becomes informational, not instructional. It signals uncertainty, but it does not decide action. This single shift changes the entire architecture of behavior. Most people live inside an inverted system. They feel fear, interpret it as danger, slow down, analyze excessively, delay action, and then reinforce self-doubt through inaction. Over time, this becomes identity. I hesitate. I overthink. I'm not confident. These are not truths. They are descriptions of repeated delay patterns. The confidence code reverses this structure completely. Action comes first, interpretation comes second, emotional response comes last. This order matters more than motivation, discipline, or intelligence, because when action leads, the nervous system is forced to recalibrate based on reality rather than imagination. And reality is always more stable than internal simulation. Another core principle of the confidence code is the removal of emotional permission systems. Most people unconsciously wait for internal permission to act. They wait to feel ready, feel certain, feel confident, feel motivated. But these feelings are not prerequisites for action. They are byproducts of repeated action. Waiting for them creates permanent delay. In the confidence code, permission is replaced with structure. If something needs to be done, it is done through the smallest possible step, immediately. No emotional negotiation, no identity debate, no extended preparation loops. This is where transformation actually happens, not in moments of insight, but in moments of irreversible action taken without emotional approval. Another essential layer is identity re-anchoring through behavior. Identity does not change through thought. It changes through evidence. Every time action happens in the presence of fear, the mind receives new data that contradicts the old identity model. I acted while afraid. I moved without certainty. I did not wait for confidence. Each of these becomes a correction to the system. Over time, the nervous system updates its prediction model. What once felt unsafe becomes familiar. What once felt heavy becomes normal. Confidence is simply familiarity with action under uncertainty. Another key principle is behavioral momentum independence. Most people rely on motivation spikes to act. But motivation is unstable. It rises and falls based on emotional state, environment, and energy levels. The confidence code does not depend on motivation, it depends on structure. Once action begins, momentum sustains it. And once momentum exists, emotional resistance becomes secondary. This is why starting is more powerful than planning. Planning preserves hesitation. Starting destroys it. Another fundamental shift is the removal of outcome-based identity evaluation. When identity depends on results, every action becomes emotionally risky. Failure is no longer a data point, it becomes a perceived reflection of self-worth. This creates paralysis at scale. In the confidence code, outcomes are decoupled from identity. Results inform adjustment, not self-worth. This removes the emotional penalty for action. When action has no identity risk attached to it, hesitation loses its primary fuel source. Another key mechanism is speed of recovery from hesitation. Even in a trained system, hesitation may still appear briefly. The difference is that it is not allowed to expand. It is treated as a passing signal, not a decision-making environment. The system does not argue with hesitation, it moves through it. Another principle is simplification of internal commands. Instead of complex motivational reasoning, the system operates on direct behavioral instructions: move, start, continue, adjust. No narrative build-up is required. This reduces cognitive load and prevents emotional distortion from entering execution. Another important transformation is comfort with incomplete certainty. Most people believe certainty must precede action, but certainty is rarely available in dynamic environments. The confidence code replaces certainty with adaptability. You do not need to know everything. You only need to be able to respond once new information appears. This creates flexibility without hesitation. Another key factor is normalization of discomfort during action. Discomfort is no longer treated as a signal to stop. It is treated as a normal part of execution under uncertainty. This removes one of the strongest triggers of avoidance. Finally, everything converges into one principle. Confidence is not the absence of fear. It is the removal of fear's authority over action. When fear no longer decides behavior, when hesitation no longer expands into delay, and when action no longer depends on emotional permission, something fundamental changes. The mind stops asking, "Do I feel ready?" and starts operating on a different question entirely. What is the next action? At that point, self-doubt does not need to be fought. It simply becomes irrelevant to the system, because a mind built on action does not collapse into hesitation. It moves. Chapter 11. After the shift. Living without internal resistance. There is a moment in deep behavioral change that is often misunderstood. It is not dramatic. It does not feel like victory. It does not announce itself with emotional intensity. Instead, it feels almost like nothing has changed, except something fundamental has stopped interfering. That interference is internal resistance, and when it weakens, the mind does not celebrate. It simply becomes quieter in the exact places where hesitation used to exist. This is the phase most people fail to recognize. They expect confidence to feel powerful, energetic, or emotionally elevated. But real confidence, once stabilized, is not loud. It is efficient. It removes unnecessary internal friction from action. After the shift, the mind no longer debates every decision. It no longer generates extended simulations for simple actions. It no longer builds identity-level consequences around routine behavior. The system becomes noticeably simpler, not because life becomes simpler, but because internal processing stops overreacting to life. Internal resistance is not just fear, it is the accumulation of all mental processes that interfere with execution. Hesitation loops, emotional forecasting, identity evaluation, perfection demands, and imagined consequence inflation. When these layers weaken, action becomes structurally lighter. But here is the critical insight. This phase does not feel like constant confidence. It feels like reduced internal noise. That is the most accurate description. The mind is still capable of doubt, but doubt no longer expands into paralysis. It appears, registers, and fades without control over behavior. This is where most transformation stabilizes or collapses. If a person misinterprets this phase, they assume nothing has changed because they do not feel dramatically different. So they return to old patterns, seeking emotional confirmation instead of structural observation. But the real shift is behavioral, not emotional. In this stage, action begins to precede interpretation as a default. The system does not wait for full internal agreement before moving. It recognizes that internal agreement is often the result of movement, not the cause of it. Another key change is reduction in self-referential thinking. In earlier stages, the mind constantly evaluates, how am I doing? What does this mean about me? Am I confident enough? After the shift, these questions lose importance. Attention moves outward toward execution rather than inward toward self-analysis. This is not detachment from self-awareness. It is removal of unnecessary self-monitoring during action. Self-monitoring during execution is one of the main causes of hesitation. It divides attention between doing and evaluating, which weakens both. When that split disappears, performance becomes more stable without additional effort. Another important change is tolerance of incomplete internal states. Previously, the mind demanded alignment before action. Clarity, certainty, motivation, readiness. After the shift, none of these are required. Action proceeds with whatever state is present. This is not emotional suppression. It is structural independence from emotional alignment. Even confusion no longer stops movement. Confusion becomes a condition for small-scale exploration rather than a signal for delay. Another layer of this phase is reduced emotional amplification. In earlier systems, small problems felt large because they were repeatedly processed internally. After the shift, emotional signals are not repeatedly reinforced. They remain proportional to actual relevance. This prevents escalation cycles where minor issues grow into perceived threats. Another important aspect is the disappearance of starting resistance. Starting used to be the most difficult phase because it required overcoming internal negotiation. After the shift, starting becomes almost automatic because negotiation no longer occurs at initiation level. Action begins before resistance has time to organize itself. But even in this stage, something important remains. Discipline is still required, but it is no longer forced. It becomes structural consistency rather than emotional effort. There is no longer a sense of pushing against oneself. The system stops resisting its own movement. And when that happens, productivity is no longer a struggle. It becomes a natural expression of how the system operates. Still, this phase is fragile in one specific way. If the system returns to overthinking during low awareness moments, old patterns can temporarily reappear. That is why the next stage, true permanence, is necessary. Because stability is not just about change. It is about irreversibility under normal conditions. Chapter 12. The permanent mode. When confidence becomes default behavior. At the final stage of this entire system, confidence is no longer something that is activated. It is no longer something that needs to be remembered, practiced, or reinforced consciously. It becomes the default operating mode of behavior itself. This is permanent mode, a condition where action does not require emotional preparation and hesitation does not develop into control. The defining feature of permanent mode is not emotional strength, it is structural consistency. The mind behaves the same way under uncertainty as it does under clarity. There is no internal shift in behavior architecture when conditions change externally. And this stability is what most people mistakenly associate with high confidence, but in reality, it is much deeper. It is system-level reliability. In permanent mode, decision-making is no longer a psychological event. It is a functional process. Input arrives, minimal interpretation occurs, and action follows. There is no extended emotional stage between perception and execution. This removes the entire space where self-doubt used to exist. Because self-doubt requires time, internal conflict, and identity evaluation. Without those components, it cannot form. Another defining characteristic is the absence of motivational dependence. Motivation becomes irrelevant because it is no longer part of the execution system. Action does not wait for activation. It is continuously available as a response to necessity. But this creates a state where consistency is no longer effort-based, it is structural. Another key aspect is emotional neutrality during execution. This does not mean emotional absence, it means emotional non-interference. Emotions exist, but they do not restructure behavior. They pass through the system without altering direction. This is critical because most systems fail, not due to lack of knowledge, but due to emotional interference during execution. Another important transformation is identity stabilization through repetition. In permanent mode, identity is no longer questioned internally. It is continuously reinforced externally through behavior. There is no gap between who I think I am and what I do. That gap is where self-doubt used to live. Another feature is automatic recovery from disruption. Even when setbacks occur, the system does not require emotional recovery time. It returns to baseline function quickly because there is no identity damage attached to outcomes. Failure becomes informational, not psychological. Another key element is reduced cognitive friction. Decisions require less internal processing because the system is no longer filtering actions through emotional or identity-based resistance layers. This makes thinking feel lighter, not because intelligence has increased, but because interference has decreased. Another defining characteristic is consistency under variability. Whether conditions are stable or unstable, performance does not significantly change. This is the clearest marker of permanent mode, behavior independence from environment. At this point, confidence is no longer a concept, it is no longer a skill. It is no longer even a state, it is simply how the system operates by default. And when behavior no longer depends on emotional permission, hesitation has nothing left to attach itself to. It disappears not because it is defeated, but because it is no longer structurally supported. Chapter 13. The invisible discipline, what no one sees behind consistent action. At the surface level, confidence looks like boldness. It looks like speaking without hesitation, acting without visible fear, and making decisions quickly. But this external expression hides something far more important underneath: invisible discipline. Invisible discipline is not about visible effort. It is not about intensity or emotional force. It is the quiet internal structure that prevents deviation from action when no one is watching, when no reward is immediate, and when emotional resistance is present but not acknowledged. Most people assume inconsistency is a motivation problem. It is not. It is a structural problem. The internal system is not designed to sustain action when emotional reinforcement is absent, so behavior becomes dependent on mood, environment, and external triggers. Invisible discipline removes that dependency completely. It begins with a shift in how action is defined internally. Action is no longer treated as something that requires emotional alignment or mental readiness. It is treated as a default response to recognition of necessity. This means the moment something is identified as needing to be done, the system does not enter debate. It transitions directly into execution pathways. no negotiation phase exists. But this is why invisible discipline cannot be observed easily from the outside. There is no visible struggle. There is no dramatic moment of overcoming resistance. The resistance is never allowed to fully activate in the first place. Another key component is elimination of internal permission seeking. In unstable systems, even simple actions require internal approval. Do I feel like it? Is now the right time? Should I wait? Invisible discipline removes these questions entirely. Not through suppression, but through structural irrelevance. The system no longer uses emotional state as a decision filter. Action is triggered by structure, not feeling. Another important layer is behavioral continuity under low stimulation. Most systems function well when there is novelty, urgency, or external pressure. But when stimulation drops, its execution collapses. This is where inconsistency emerges. Invisible discipline is tested most in low stimulation environments. When nothing external is pushing behavior, the system continues operating based on internal architecture alone. Another critical principle is reduction of decision re-entry points. Many people repeatedly re-evaluate the same action multiple times before executing it. Each re-entry adds friction and increases the chance of hesitation. Invisible discipline allows only one entry point per action. Once recognized, it either moves into execution or is dismissed completely. No repeated evaluation loops are allowed. Another important mechanism is suppression of later thinking. The phrase, "I'll do it later," is one of the most dangerous internal constructs because it preserves avoidance while maintaining self-image. Invisible discipline removes later as a valid internal category. Action exists either now or not at all. Another key factor is identity consistency enforcement. Behavior is not adjusted based on temporary emotional state. Even when motivation is low, action remains structurally consistent with established direction. This prevents regression cycles. Another transformation is reduction of internal storytelling. The mind naturally generates narratives around action, why it matters, how difficult it is, what it means. Invisible discipline removes unnecessary narrative expansion and keeps focus on execution reality. At this stage, discipline is no longer felt as effort, it is experienced as absence of internal resistance to execution initiation, and that absence is what makes it invisible. Because what most people perceive as discipline is actually the struggle against resistance. In invisible discipline, the struggle does not occur at all. Chapter 14. The final reversal. When fear becomes irrelevant to action. At the deepest level of this entire system, a final reversal occurs. It is not a psychological trick or motivational shift. It is a structural change in how fear is processed by the mind. In earlier stages, fear is something that must be managed, reduced, or overridden. Even in advanced systems, fear still exists as background noise that requires discipline to ignore. But in the final reversal, fear loses relevance to action entirely, not because it disappears, but because it no longer connects to decision pathways. Fear remains as a signal, but it is disconnected from behavioral control. It is processed like weather, observed, acknowledged, but not obeyed. This is the final separation between emotion and execution. The key transformation is that fear stops being interpreted as instruction. In unstable systems, fear equals stop. In advanced systems, fear equals caution. But in the final system, fear equals information only. It has no directive power. Once this shift stabilizes, action becomes independent of emotional environment. Whether fear is present or absent, behavior does not change. Another important mechanism is collapse of fear-based forecasting. Fear usually operates through imagined future scenarios. The mind simulates negative outcomes and then reacts as if they are already real. In the final system, forecasting is recognized as simulation, not reality. Simulations are not allowed to override present execution. Another key principle is emotional flattening of uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer produces escalation. It simply remains as an unresolved variable that does not interfere with movement. This removes one of the primary triggers of hesitation. Another transformation is removal of identity threat perception. Fear often escalates when outcomes are tied to identity. Failure feels like self-definition, but in the final reversal, identity is no longer constructed from single outcomes. It is constructed from behavioral continuity. This breaks the emotional weight attached to individual actions. Another important factor is stabilization of action under emotional contradiction. Fear may exist simultaneously with confidence, uncertainty with clarity, hesitation with movement. And these contradictions no longer create paralysis. They are processed as parallel states, not conflicting commands. Another key mechanism is non-reactive engagement. The system does not wait for emotional resolution before acting. It engages directly with reality while internal signals are still active. This is the final stage of confidence, not emotional control, but emotional irrelevance to execution timing. Another principle is permanence of structural override. Once this system is established, it does not rely on willpower to maintain itself. It becomes default behavior architecture. Fear may appear, but it no longer finds a pathway into decision-making. At this point, something fundamental becomes clear. Confidence was never about removing fear. It was about removing fear's authority over action. And once that authority is gone, fear can still exist, but it no longer matters. Because action no longer waits for emotional permission, it simply continues. Chapter 15. The confidence that no longer breaks. Final integration of the system. At this final stage, there is nothing left to build in the way people usually understand improvement. There is no new technique to learn, no additional mindset shift to install, no final layer of motivation to unlock. What remains is integration. The point where everything that was previously learned stops being separate concepts and becomes a single operating system. This is where confidence stops being something you practice and becomes something you are no longer separate from. The earlier stages of this journey focused on dismantling hesitation, interrupting fear loops, compressing decisions, and removing emotional interference from action. But even after all of that, many systems still remain fragile in one subtle way. They still recognize confidence as something they are applying. That separation is the final illusion. In true integration, there is no longer a moment where the mind asks, how do I act confidently here? The question itself disappears because behavior no longer passes through that filter. Action is not evaluated for confidence. Action is simply executed based on necessity and direction. This is the point where internal identity fully stabilizes, not as a belief, but as a pattern of irreversible behavior. The mind no longer reopens old negotiations because there is no longer a system in place that supports negotiation as a valid step. The architecture has changed. One of the most important markers of this stage is the disappearance of internal resistance cycles. Earlier, resistance appeared as hesitation, overthinking, or emotional delay. Even in advanced stages, resistance still existed, it just failed to control behavior. Now, resistance loses even its presence as an active process. It becomes background noise so faint that it no longer registers as something requiring attention. This is not suppression, it is structural obsolescence. Another defining characteristic is continuity of action without emotional confirmation. Most systems require emotional validation to sustain effort. People need to feel progress, feel motivated, feel aligned. Without that, they collapse back into hesitation. In full integration, emotional validation is no longer required for continuation. Action continues regardless of internal emotional state. This removes one of the last remaining dependencies between feeling and behavior. Another key shift is the removal of self-observation during action. In unstable systems, part of the mind constantly monitors performance. Am I doing this correctly? How am I doing? What does this mean about me? This split attention weakens execution. In integrated systems, attention is fully directed outward toward the task itself. Self-monitoring is reduced to post-action review, not real-time interference. Another important principle is irreversible behavioral identity. At this level, identity is not something that changes moment to moment. It is formed from accumulated evidence of consistent action under uncertainty. The mind no longer asks who you are before action. It already knows through repetition of behavior, and because that identity is reinforced continuously, there is no instability requiring internal reassessment. Another transformation is elimination of motivational dependence loops. Motivation is no longer part of the decision system. It may appear, but it is not required for initiation or continuation of action. This is critical because motivation is inherently unstable. It rises and falls based on internal chemistry, external feedback, and environmental conditions. A system built on motivation will always be vulnerable. A system built beyond it is structurally stable. Another key feature is emotional neutrality under uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer creates internal escalation. It does not trigger urgency loops or hesitation cycles. It is processed as normal environmental condition, not a threat. This removes one of the deepest roots of self-doubt, the belief that uncertainty must be resolved before movement. In full integration, uncertainty is simply part of the landscape in which action occurs. Another important shift is the end of identity-based fear. Fear still exists biologically, but it no longer connects to identity interpretation. It does not mean I am at risk. It means this situation contains unknowns. Nothing more. This separation is what prevents fear from expanding into paralysis. Another defining feature is structural calm under pressure, not emotional calm in the sense of feeling relaxed, but functional calm in the sense that behavior does not degrade under stress. The system continues operating with the same clarity regardless of intensity of external conditions. At this point, confidence is no longer something that fluctuates. It is stable because it is no longer dependent on internal state consistency. Finally, the most important realization emerges. Confidence was never built. It was uncovered. What was built throughout this entire system was not confidence itself, but the removal of everything that prevented it from expressing itself naturally. Fear was not destroyed, it was disarmed. Doubt was not erased, it was made irrelevant. Hesitation was not fought, it was structurally bypassed. And when all interference is removed, what remains is simple: a mind that acts without needing permission, a system that continues without needing emotional approval, a behavior pattern that does not collapse under uncertainty. This is the confidence code in its final form. Not a feeling, not a mindset, but a permanent mode of action that no longer breaks when fear appears, because fear no longer leads and action no longer waits.